Oh yeah, that's true. Sorry, I should move to 11:10 and then, yeah. So I don't know, I'm not sure if my watch is fast or slow, but we're about right now, so we'll make a start if that's all right. So when you're ready to, apparently being recorded, so I've not got to say anything out of turn. I've got my little helper with me. Oh, she's there. So hopefully she's going to pull the right kind of faces in the background. Kristen asked me if I could give a talk on something, and I think I very optimistically and slightly foolishly said I'd talk about the early medieval period or the church before 1111. Fortunately, and then at one point I thought I had 90 minutes to speak, and I thought I'm never going to fill 90 minutes. And it turned out I've only got 20 minutes to speak, so that's fine. That's a bit more doable. What are you doing? Why? Because inevitably this period in this part of the world there isn't a huge amount to say. We're talking about 1111 is before, really in this part of the world, before the Norman Conquest, back into what traditionally was always called the Dark Ages, which we don't really use as a term anymore, even though in this part of the world it is quite relevant because we know very, very little. There's really very little to go on in terms of documentary sources, archaeology or anything really. There's very, very little to actually use. The Dark Ages, or the early medieval period, is really that period between the collapse of the Roman Empire, however that happened, however that panned out, which is a lot of debate about exactly what happened, in about 410, for the sake of picking a number out of thin air. Sometime in the 5th century anyway, until the Norman Conquest, which obviously, you know, if you've learnt at school exactly what happened. The Romans march off, the Saxons come in, and then we have the Norman Conquest, and that changes everything. Which, of course, in this part of the world is not the case at all. None of that really happened in that order. It didn't really work like that at all in this far north. In this part of the world, the bit that became England after within that period, really probably saw a much longer period of control by people who saw themselves as Britons. That is, the native people who were already here before the Romans turned up, and basically the people who inherited the end of the Roman Empire. And a lot of those people carried on thinking themselves as Romans well into the 5th century, maybe even to the 6th century. They were still effectively pretending that they were Romans and going around giving themselves Roman-style titles and attempting to live a Romanized lifestyle, even though all the luxury goods that they'd relied on stopped. The major thing that really changed with the end of the Roman Empire was, A, no Roman money, and B, very little of the luxury trade goods that we got used to in this country, which were coming from the Roman Empire. All that kind of collapsed, basically, due to the collapse in sort of overall control of things. Makes it very hard to trade pottery if you don't control the areas that you're trading the pottery from, basically. And in this part of the world, it's quite likely that these native Britons ended up forming their own kingdoms. They sort of splintered off into lots of different groups. And the northwest of England and maybe into southern Scotland became part of an area known as Reged, which was one of these kingdoms, the exact boundaries of which, the exact extent of which, even the existence of which is debated by any number of scholars. Will give you different opinions on where it was, how big an area it covered. Some people have it stretching all the way from southwest Scotland all the way down to the River Mersey in Liverpool. Some people have it as only being part of Scotland. In fact, if you go on to the next slide, and there we go, yep, that shows you some general approximations of where it might have been. And the point is that this whole idea in other parts of the country that the Saxons turn up, or the Anglo-Saxons turn up, they take over and start controlling everything, doesn't really hold here for a long, long, long time. It took the Anglian Empire kingdoms of Northumbria a long time to really have any sort of control in this part of the world. And to be honest, even then it's quite debatable how much control they even had by the sort of end of the 7th century. It's suggested that their control was really very nominal. They were sort of effectively in charge, but really the people doing all the work were local rulers who were actually, looking to them as the overall rulers. If you've got the next one. Oh, there we go. I love that. That slide to me typifies everything about the idea of who the Britons are. From Monty Python, Holy Grail, who are the Britons? So we're all Britons. And to me, although it's nonsense, obviously, that really typifies that period, and that nobody really seems to have any idea who was in charge, who anybody really was. Probably people didn't even know who their king was, because the areas were so splintered, the communication was very difficult, and, it's all well and good saying, I'm the king of somewhere, but of course it doesn't mean anything to your average person living in that area, because they never see you, for starters. They're never going to see any of these people. Anyway, yeah. And also, just to confuse matters even further, there's a later resurgence of kind of British control that comes from the Kingdom of Strathclyde. Of course, Strathclyde is in what's now Scotland, so it tends to get a bit mixed up in Scottish history, and that's the other problem with us being on the border being an enormous moving area up and down the country. Our influence is from Scotland most of the time, to be honest, of what became Scotland and the Irish Sea, and that's the important thing to remember. We are probably more heavily influenced by the Irish Sea region and Scotland here than we are by the rest of what became England in the early medieval period. Because the Irish Sea, which now we see as a big barrier, was an enormous highway with people going up and down it in boats, moving backwards and forwards, bringing ideas, and particularly religious ideas, which is relevant to this, what I'm saying today. The Kingdom of Strathclyde had a major resurgence in the late 9th century and basically started spreading southwards into what's now the county of Cumbria. And the irony is, of course, people will say, oh, Cumbria is not a real county, it only existed in 1974. The first mention of Cumbria is actually in 937, when Strathclyde seems to have adopted the name Cumbria for its new, wider, larger area. But if you go to the next slide, that gives you some ideas. But again, the extent of which Strathclyde and how far Strathclyde actually spread is very, very debatable. I've argued that it stretched all the way down to Furness at least, but other people will say it didn't come anywhere near that far. It only came into what became Cumberland. And of course, the next most important influencing people who turn up in this period are the Vikings. And of course, everybody in Cumbria bangs on about the Vikings like nobody's business. In fact, it's become, to be honest, I think, overemphasised how important the Vikings were. People now are starting to talk more of the Viking Age. I'll stop doing that at some point. Let's talk about the Viking Age or the Viking era, which is basically the period in which the Vikings start to have an influence. You've got the next slide, I think. This is your classic Viking image. This is just an image I pinched off the internet. The classic idea is the Vikings turned up pillaging and raping their way through the country, attacking monasteries, stealing things left, right and centre, and were basically just a massive nuisance. By the end of the 8th century, that is indeed the case. On the east side of the country, they were attacking the east coast, coming from Scandinavia and Denmark and areas like that, and attacking areas in the east coast. In this part of the country, it took a lot longer for them to really have any real influence. They do start to get involved through the Danelaw and all that kind of thing, but that was, again, much more easterly. The real influence seems to be at the beginning of the 10th century when they were basically, the Irish kings in Dublin, the Vikings had taken over Dublin by that point. The Irish kings in Dublin basically kicked the Vikings out. The Vikings are forced to flee, effectively like refugees, but you get the impression they're refugees who had a lot of money. They start heading across the Irish Sea and they end up in the northwest of England, a lot of them in Scotland. And so that's when we start seeing their real influence. So they turn up in that period, as running away effectively from Ireland. But they start to have an enormous influence in the area. And I always kind of envisage something along the lines of, these are quite wealthy Vikings escaping from Dublin, probably the only ones who could get away with it. It's a bit like in the Second World War, the first batch of Jewish refugees were able to get out, the ones who had money basically, who could escape, find somewhere to go and had enough money to travel. I suspect a lot of the Vikings who left Dublin were the ones who had enough money to get out, had a ship that could sail them out. They arrive on the west coast of Cumbria with big boxes of silver, and I suspect they're basically just going to the local farmers and saying, here's a big box of silver, can I have your farm please? And the local farmers are saying, yep, sure you can, and you can marry my daughter while you're at it. And they were probably turning up along those sorts of lines, not turning up, attacking and taking over at all. They weren't. I don't think that's how it happened, but anyway, beside the point. And of course, the classic major change at the end of the early medieval period is the Norman Conquest, 1066 and all that, which obviously meant we all suddenly became French, which of course is fine if you're living in the southeast of England where all the action happened. Of course, in the northwest of England, none of the action really happened, and it took at least a generation for any real change to occur. And it's not until the Normans finally take Carlisle in 1092 that we really see any influence in this area at all. The only archaeological and historical evidence, if you've got the next slide, is Aldingham Motte. That's an aerial view of Aldingham Motte. The Fleming family turn up in the area in about 1100-ish, or maybe a little bit later, a bit earlier. They build themselves a motte at Aldingham, and that's really the first sort of really tangible evidence for sort of the Norman conquest in this part of the world. Before that, you don't really see much evidence for it at all. It's place names. I mean, the Domesday Survey, Ulverston is mentioned in the Domesday Survey 1086, but the Domesday Survey for this area is so limited, some people have suggested they basically got as far as Lancaster, were too scared to go any further north, and asked people in Lancaster, what's over there? And they just said, oh, well, there's this place called Ulverston, and there's this place called, hang on a minute, what's it called again? something or other like this, and they wrote it down in their best attempt to translate the local Norse Anglian dialect into French English, and that's why we get these garbled responses that make no sense at all, and we still don't know where half these places are, because they were working either off older records or off sort of second-hand information. And of course, the Domesday Survey stopped basically at the River Duddon. They didn't really go any further than the River Duddon because that was nominally in Scotland at that point. So that's just a bit of background about the area, that it's hugely complicated. It doesn't fit within your standard textbook idea of how England worked in that time, that period in history, and there's very, very limited evidence. So when I was asked to give a talk about, well, I suggested giving a talk about this in relation to Ulverston Church, I realised, well, you're not starting off on a good footing, really, with virtually no evidence to go from. But there are a few tangible things. It's traditionally always said that Ulverston Church was built in the year of 4-1s, that is 1111. Although quite where the evidence for this comes from, I'm not entirely sure. It seems to be one of these convenient things that someone's come up with at some point. However, it is conveniently the point at which the Flemings turn up at Aldingham. So around about the same time the Flemings arrive, this church was apparently being built, although I suspect there was something already here. What that probably means is 1111 probably means there was a substantial amount of new building done at that time, or sometime around that point. The Flemings of Aldingham and all the local manorial lords obviously had an influence on the local churches at that time. Documentary evidence for the actual church itself, though, is quite limited until the 13th century, really. There's very little evidence to actually go on. But the church itself definitely has elements of medieval fabric in it, including some quite early pieces. Next slide. The door that you've all come through is it's described as Norman, probably 11th or 12th century, chevron decorated doorway. It's probably not in its original location. It's been moved from somewhere else in the church to that position in a Victorian rebuilding at some point. But it's evidence for an early building. It's about very, very limited amount of evidence for an early building. Next slide. And more recently, these don't look like very much, but more recently these were discovered during the restoration of one of the tombstones, one of the 19th century tombs. These are fragments of medieval grave covers, that was just basically stuffed with rubble inside one of the 19th century graves. So probably they were out in the graveyard at some point, and they're quite big, the full-size grave covers probably with a cross design. You'll have seen them elsewhere. They typically have a cross, and sometimes they have shears and various other symbols on them. That's two pieces which are now visible in the churchyard, or visible in the church. So we know there was definitely a medieval building here. So it's reasonable to assume there was something before, 1111. But what actual evidence is there? There's two elements of place name evidence which do indicate something was going on earlier. The first name is the name of Ulverston, Ulfar's Tun. Tun basically just means a town or a village, probably not a very big town, but compared to a hamlet, a much more substantial town. Probably in the early medieval period it would have been tiny, though, very little to it. Ulfar is a sort of Anglo-Norse name that basically means wolf warrior. Now people have got rather overexcited about this idea that wolf warrior, that they think that the town was set up by some man that fought wolves or fought with wolves, or I don't know, did something, or was a werewolf or something. I'm not sure what they think. Basically, it's just a name. It just means the town of someone called Ulfar. Doesn't mean he was a wolf warrior. In the same way that everybody's name means something if you go back thousands of years, doesn't mean you are that thing, if you see what I mean. Anyway, the wolf has become quite a popular emblem in the town. If you go to the next slide. You'll recognise Wolftown Gin on your right side, and the wolf on the Ulverston School UVHS school crest. So, and you do get some. The Victorians, bless them, had some very odd ideas about things, and so Ulverston for a long time, for quite a substantial time, from the 18th century to the 19th century, was Ulverstone with an E on the end of it. And the E just seems to have been a Georgian and Victorian affectation that someone decided it should have an E on the end of it. So they started writing with an E on the end of it. And in fact, there are actually articles in the local newspapers debating whether there should be an E on the end of it. Well, there shouldn't be an E on the end of it because it's not stone, it is tun, Ulverston. It's not Ulfar's stone. And so then people started saying, it comes from Wolfstone, it's the stone where the wolves were, or somewhere where something happened. And it's nonsense, there's no stone where the wolves were. Anyway, that's irrelevant. I'll just go start ranting about it. Of course, the other thing to remember is that just because somewhere's called Tun, you might think, well, that's a settlement big enough to have a church. You know, why not? It's a town, it could have a church. But of course, in this area, you've got Gleaston, you've got Stainton, which don't have churches of their own. So that is no guarantee of anything. But it means there was definitely a settlement here before the Norman Conquest, going back into the 7th, 8th, 9th century, who knows. A more interesting, or perhaps more pertinent reference to the church is documentary references to somewhere called Kirktarn. Now, it's not ever specified where Kirktarn is, but you can infer from the context in which the name Kirktarn is mentioned that it's somewhere near the church. It's always mentioned in relation to the end of Ratton Row. Well, the end of Ratton Row was down where Quebec Street starts, so it's not a million miles away. If you go to the next slide, I hope you can see that. The church is up at the top, the black block at the top. This is a Wood's map of 1832. It's the earliest map of Ulverston, and it has some field names and some interesting other details on it. The big field to the bottom of the church, just outside the churchyard, is called Tarn Field, I think, if I'm right. It's filled in by that point. The Tarn's gone by that point. But I suspect that is Kirktarn, or that is where Kirktarn was. I can't prove it, but I suspect it was. And of course, it makes perfect sense. It's the Tarn next to the Kirk, the church. Well, of course, what's the significance of the place named Kirk? You'll see it in any number of places in this part of the world, up into Scotland, into Lancashire. Kirk is an old word meaning church. It comes probably from a Norse word, kirkja, which basically means a place of worship or something like that. There's some debate about it. If you're in Scotland, they seem to think it might derive from Gaelic, but anyway, whatever it is, it derives from an early word suggesting a church or a place of worship. So it potentially suggests a church that was already there when the Vikings arrived, or which the Vikings were around when it was built. So a potentially very early church. Now, the only problem with that is that Norse language was still being used in this area. People still could speak Norse into the 12th century, because the inscription at Pennington, the runic tympanum at Pennington, mentions Gamel the Pennington, who was around in the 11, whatever it was. So just because something's a Viking word doesn't mean it was coined in the Viking period, but potentially suggests we've got a very early site. The other interesting factor is the shape of the churchyard, which doesn't look like very much now when you look at it, but of course it's been modified over time, it's been extended and enlarged, and of course the whole of the bottom end is a modification or an addition that was added in the 1850s, so everything beyond that footpath was added in the 1850s. Slightly unusually compared to quite a lot of churches associated with medieval towns, the church isn't actually in the town really, not historically, it's actually quite a long way out of the medieval town. If you go to the next slide, go past that, next one. And I hope you can see that. I haven't got a pointer. That's a plan approximately showing where the medieval streets in the town are. So all those red bits are medieval streets, all the yellow bits are medieval kind of burghish plots, so probably 12th, 13th century and a bit later. The church is that kind of green blob at the top. And you can see it's actually quite a long way out of the medieval town. All the grey bit is all the modern town. So the Victorian, 18th century and Victorian onwards town. The red and yellow bits are the medieval town. So the original church was quite a long way out of town. Not right. You go to somewhere like Appleby. Appleby's your classic medieval town. It's got a castle at one end, it's got a church at the other end, and in between is the medieval town. Dalton, for example, is the same. You've got a castle and a church at one end, the medieval town runs off from them. They're right in the centre, the focal point of the town almost. Ulverston Church is really a long way out of the middle of the town, which is unusual and a bit odd for a medieval church, which you would think would be built with the town in mind, positioned in relation to the town, not cut off by the town and not isolated. And often these isolated churches are generally speaking thought to be fairly early. Again, I say generally speaking because there's no facts about any of this, it's just generally the case or general opinion. Potentially it's because a lot of the earlier churches acted more like monasteries. They weren't really a parish. The parish system didn't come in until after the Norman Conquest, so before that churches really were more like monastic sites with a handful of people working them, and they didn't have a lot of interaction. They weren't running the town like later on. Obviously the parish system becomes all-encompassing. Earlier on they're more like monastic sites. They're quite isolated, and they were meant to be isolated. That was on purpose. The other interesting aspect of the shape of the churchyard and the position of the church is the churchyard shape itself is quite circular in its original form. Not perfectly circular, but quite circular. You go back to the next slide, sorry. Again, it doesn't show up that well on Wood's map, but you have to imagine that the footpath at the bottom is the footpath that runs through the churchyard now. The original churchyard boundary was at that footpath, so it's actually quite an oval kind of shaped churchyard. It's not rectangular, it's not square, and it's not until after 1851 that it becomes much more rectangular like it is now. If you go to the next one, that's the 1891 Ordnance Survey map, and you can see how it's become much bigger, much more rectangular, and of course over time it's been kind of squared off as streets have been built around it, and that's kind of made it more rectangular looking. A circular churchyard, again, isn't really proof of anything, but if you read lots and lots of different sources, it will suggest that a circular churchyard is a sign of an early one. And generally speaking, it's because the idea these things operated almost like a monastic site with a circular boundary, and that was just how they were set up. There's several examples in the local area of very circular oval churchyards. If you go to the next slide. These are just two. That's St Bridget's at Bekermot on the left-hand side. Originally very oval churchyard, but now enlarged and rectangularised. And then, of course, on the right, a very local one, Pennington Church, which is almost perfectly circular and very raised up as well. When you drive up to it, you basically drive right round this circle. Very obvious. Ulverston Churchyard may have been as circular as that at one point. Obviously, we don't know now. Of course, the problem with this is that in Wales, where early churches, there's quite a lot of research been done into that, there were some really good examples of churches in isolated positions sitting inside circular boundaries that showed up as crop marks. And everyone said for years, oh yeah, they're early Christian churches, they're probably 6th, 7th century AD, really early sites. They dug the ditches, and the ditches turned out to be Iron Age. So, sometimes it's potentially reusing an older site as well, which is another issue entirely, and obviously problematic because you can't just go digging huge holes in the churchyard to find out. Well, you could, but maybe one day. And in fact, it's actually possible that the sort of slightly circular shape of the churchyard in Ulverston affected the layout of the whole town. If you've got the next slide. Oh, sorry, not that one. No. Actually, go back. No, I've missed a slide out. But on the early medieval, the plan of the medieval town, there's a very large curving line. In fact, you can see it. You look on the modern map, you can see it. Where Back Lane comes round, there's a very long, wide curve. And I do wonder if that's actually built there on purpose up against another boundary that was an outer boundary for the church, because sometimes these early medieval church sites had one inner boundary, an outer boundary, all circular, like radiating circles. And I do wonder whether the way Back Lane's been laid out, it's actually curving around that on purpose because they couldn't come any further this way. So that's the evidence, such as there is any evidence. It's not very extensive. What are we missing, though? That's the problem. I mean, there's so much stuff we're missing that we should have here if there's an early church. One thing that's really missing is cross fragments. Go to the next one. We've got umpteen extremely good examples of early medieval cross fragments, Anglian and Norse period, and slightly later sometimes, all up the west coast, all the way down to Lancashire, and yet there's a big glaring hole in this area where we've got 2 or 3 early parish churches, Ulverston and Dalton, for example, with no evidence of these things. They should be finding these here. Why aren't they here? They're usually found when the Victorians were doing up the churches. Now, were the people doing the church here just particularly unobservant? I don't know, maybe. I mean, because the problem is a lot of the discovery of these, when they were found built into the church, when the work was being done, it relied on the workmen being very astute, or the vicar just happening to be on site. I mean, some of the accounts you read, it's a miracle any of these things were found, because it was literally just, as they were smashing a wall down, they found a piece of cross, and you think, well, it's lucky anyone found that. The only ones in this area are in Erswick, if you've got the next slide, which has got this very impressive runic one with runes on it, which was actually used as being used as a lintel in part of the church, which is why it's that shape, because they've actually shaped the back end to make a lintel block. So at some point, somebody's hacked a big chunk of that off to make a lintel, which you wonder how much was lost at that stage. But the weird thing about that is that Erswick's not even mentioned in the Doomsday Survey. It's not even an early, particularly old parish church, apparently. But they've got 2 crosses there. So why haven't we got one here? So we really need to keep our eyes peeled. While you're doing all this work around the churchyard, keep an eye out for any old bits of stone. You've already found these bits of grave cover. Every time a bit of ivy comes off the boundary wall, I go and have a look to see if there's anything sticking out. any bits of interesting worked red sandstone, keep an eye out and have a look at them, because we just need to find that one little piece, and that'll really prove there was something going on, which I'm sure there was. But otherwise, it's a question of keeping your eyes peeled. Or if I was ever allowed to dig any holes anywhere, there's a couple of places I could dig some holes, and that might prove something, but it's difficult digging holes in a graveyard. But yeah, we keep our eyes peeled, and something will hopefully turn up one day. Thank you very much. And if you've got any questions, then I am around, or I can do them now, whatever works.